So you want to own a car wash. Not because you love washing cars, because you've noticed something that looks almost unfair. A dirty car pulls into a tunnel. A machine sprays it with water and chemicals for a few minutes, and the owner gets paid. Then another car arrives. Then another. And if you've built the right kind of car wash, you can have hundreds of customers paying you every day without needing hundreds of employees. That sounds like an almost perfect business. But here's the part nobody tells you. The car wash isn't really selling clean cars. It's selling access to a piece of land that can turn traffic into recurring cash flow. And that changes everything. Because the $15 wash is only the visible part of the business. Underneath, it is a much bigger machine. Millions of dollars in real estate. Hundreds of thousands in equipment. Water and chemical consumption. Debt payments. Maintenance. Insurance. Labor. Membership. Churn. Weather. Competition. And one number that can determine whether the entire investment becomes a cash flow machine or a multi-million-dollar mistake. Cars per day. Because if you own a restaurant and Tuesday is slow, you can turn off the lights and go home. If you own a car wash, the mortgage doesn't close. The property tax doesn't disappear. The tunnel still needs maintenance. The equipment still depreciates. And the land still costs you money. Whether 10 cars show up or 10,000. That's the brutal economics of this business. You don't get paid because you own a car wash. You get paid because you can keep an expensive piece of real estate, expensive machinery, and recurring customers working at the same time. And when those three things line up, the economics can get ridiculous. A single location can process thousands of vehicles every week. Memberships can turn occasional customers into recurring revenue. Automation can keep labor surprisingly low. And every additional car can push more revenue through infrastructure you've already paid for. But when the math goes wrong, that same leverage works against you. Because now you're not operating a simple car wash. You're carrying millions of dollars of fixed costs and hoping enough strangers decide to turn their steering wheels into your parking lot. So the real question isn't, how much does a car wash make? The real question is, how many cars does it take to make the economics work? And once you know that number, you can finally understand why some car wash owners build incredibly profitable businesses, while others end up owning nothing more than a very expensive tunnel full of broken machines. So let's break down what it actually costs to own one. Before a car wash makes its first dollar, you have to spend millions. And this is where the ownership fantasy usually starts to crack. Because when most people imagine buying a car wash, they imagine buying the business. In reality, you're often buying land, construction, equipment, permits, infrastructure, and a customer base all at once. And those are very different assets. Let's say you find an existing express car wash in a strong suburban market. The owner wants $4 million. At first glance, that sounds expensive. But now break the number apart. Maybe the land is worth $1.5 million. The building and improvements are worth another $1 million. The tunnel equipment, vacuums, payment systems, and water infrastructure could represent hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the remaining value is the operating business itself, the memberships, the customer relationships, the location, the cash flow, the brand, and the expectation that all of it keeps producing money after you take over. This is important because a car wash isn't like buying a normal small business. You can't simply rent a cheap storefront, buy some inventory, and start selling. The entire business is tied to a physical location. And that location has to be engineered for cars. You need enough land for the entrance, enough space for stacking vehicles, enough room for the tunnel, enough room for vacuum stations, enough drainage, enough water capacity, enough electrical infrastructure, and enough visibility that a driver can actually see you before they pass. A beautiful building in the wrong location is worthless. A mediocre building on the right road can be incredibly valuable. That's the first major economic principle of the business. Traffic is inventory. A restaurant needs food. A retailer needs merchandise. A car wash needs vehicles. And unlike inventory in a warehouse, you can't store tomorrow's customers. If 20,000 cars pass your property today and only 200 enter, the other 19,800 are gone forever. That's why site selection becomes one of the most important decisions an owner makes. And it's also why good car wash real estate can become incredibly expensive. Because you're not just paying for square footage, you're paying for access to demand. Now let's say you don't buy an existing wash. You decide to build one from scratch. This is where the capital requirements become even more uncomfortable. The land alone might cost millions in a high-value market. Then comes site preparation. Utilities, concrete, drainage. The building, the tunnel, conveyor systems, water reclamation, chemical systems, vacuum stations, payment terminals, lighting, signage, landscaping, cameras, software, and dozens of smaller components. Customers will never notice until one of them stops working. The final construction bill can climb very quickly. And here's the strange part. Most of these expenses don't increase much when your 10th customer arrives instead of your 9th. The tunnel doesn't need to be rebuilt. The land doesn't get larger. The building doesn't suddenly cost more. That's why car washes have such strong operating leverage. Once the infrastructure is paid for, you can push more vehicles through it. And that's where the business can become extremely attractive. Imagine the tunnel and property are already costing you millions. You process 100 cars, then 200, then 300. The infrastructure stays mostly the same, but revenue keeps increasing. That means the economics of the 200 first car can be dramatically better than the economics of the first 20 cars, because you're spreading fixed costs across more transactions. But there's a dangerous assumption hidden inside that idea. It assumes the cars actually show up. And that's why owners obsess over throughput. A tunnel might technically be capable of processing 150 cars per hour. But if the location only generates enough demand for 50, that theoretical capacity is meaningless. You've paid for machinery that sits idle. And idle machinery is expensive. This is one of the biggest differences between a good car wash and a great car wash. The great one isn't necessarily the one with the most impressive tunnel. It's the one that keeps that tunnel busy. Because the machine has a capacity, the land has a capacity, the parking area has a capacity, and the road outside has a finite amount of traffic. Everything has a ceiling. So the owner has to solve a very specific problem. How do you convert passing traffic into paying customers? The first answer is obvious: visibility. If a driver can see the wash from the road, the decision becomes easy. Dirty car, car wash, turn. But if the entrance is hidden behind another building, or requires an awkward left turn, or is difficult to enter during rush hour, you can lose customers before they even know you exist. This is why two properties with the same number of nearby residents can have radically different values. One might be positioned directly on a major commuter corridor. The other might be technically nearby, but practically invisible. And in this business, practical distance matters more than geographic distance. A driver doesn't think, "This car wash is 0.7 miles away." They think, "Can I get in without making my morning worse?" That tiny difference can determine whether a location gets 100 cars a day or 500. And once you understand that, you start to understand why experienced operators often care more about site economics than the machines themselves. Because machines can be replaced. Land is harder to replace. A competitor can buy the same tunnel. They can buy the same vacuums. They can copy your wash packages. They can even undercut your prices. But they can't easily copy your exact corner. That's the moat. And it's also the trap. Because the same scarcity that makes a great location valuable makes it expensive to acquire. So now the owner has a capital problem. You might have a profitable business, but you still need millions up front to control the asset. And most owners aren't paying cash. They're using debt, which means the car wash now has another customer. One who never drives through the tunnel, the bank. And the bank gets paid before the owner does. Every month. Regardless of whether the weather was perfect or it rained for 6 straight days. Regardless of whether memberships grew or customers disappeared. Regardless of whether the tunnel processed 500 cars or 150. The debt payment is fixed. And that creates the next layer of the economics. Because the question is no longer simply, can this car wash generate revenue? It's, can this car wash generate enough predictable cash flow to support millions of dollars of debt? That is a much harder question. And it's the reason a car wash that looks incredibly profitable from the outside can produce surprisingly little money for the actual owner. Because between the customer's $15 and the owner's final dollar, there is an entire economic machine taking its cut. And next, we're going inside that machine. Because the $15 wash is not where the real economics begin. It's where they disappear. The $15 wash is a lie. A customer pulls into your car wash. They tap their card. $15. The transaction looks finished. But for the owner, the transaction has barely started. Because that $15 isn't profit. It's the raw material. And the entire business is built around answering one question. How much of that $15 can you actually keep? Start with the obvious costs. Water, chemicals, electricity, credit card, processing, labor, maintenance, insurance, software, cleaning, waste, and, eventually, equipment replacement. None of these costs are individually catastrophic. That's what makes the business deceptive. A car wash doesn't usually get destroyed by one enormous expense. It gets squeezed by dozens of smaller ones every single day. Take water. A modern wash may use water very efficiently compared with older systems, especially when it uses reclamation and recycling. But efficient doesn't mean free. You still need water coming into the system. You still need pumps. You still need filtration. You still need treatment. And you still need a system capable of handling thousands of vehicles. Then there are chemicals, soap, wax, drying agents, tire treatments, pre-soak, different chemicals for different stages of the tunnel. The customer sees bubbles. The owner sees recurring supply costs. Then there's electricity, pumps, motors, conveyor systems, dryers, lighting, vacuum stations, payment equipment. Everything is running because cars are moving. And the more powerful the tunnel becomes, the more energy it can consume. Then comes labor. And this is where the modern express model has an advantage. You don't need an employee physically washing every car. Instead, you might have a small team managing the site, someone at the entrance, someone monitoring the tunnel, someone handling customers, someone keeping the property clean, someone dealing with equipment problems. That can make labor dramatically more efficient than a full-service detailing operation. But there's a catch. The fewer employees you have, the more each employee matters. If you only have 5 people operating the site and one person calls out, that's not a small inconvenience. That's a meaningful percentage of your workforce disappearing for the day. And because the business is built around speed, delays are expensive. If cars start backing up, customers get frustrated. If the tunnel slows down, throughput falls. And if throughput falls, your fixed costs are being spread across fewer transactions. This is why speed matters so much. A car wash is basically a production line. The faster you can safely process vehicles, the more revenue you can generate from the same physical footprint. But speed creates another problem, where every car entering the tunnel is another cycle, another conveyor movement, another pump cycle, another set of brushes, another set of dryers, another payment, another opportunity for something to break. And this is where maintenance becomes one of the most underestimated expenses. Because customers don't care that your conveyor belt has processed 100,000 vehicles. They care that their car moves. If it stops, your revenue stops. A single mechanical failure can turn the most profitable hour of the day into the most expensive hour of the week. Imagine your tunnel normally processes 40 cars an hour at a $15 average ticket. That's $600 of gross revenue every hour. Now imagine a major equipment failure shuts you down for 6 hours on a Saturday. You haven't just lost 6 hours. You've lost the customers who would have arrived during those 6 hours. Some of them will come back tomorrow. Some won't. And some will discover the competitor down the road. That's why maintenance isn't simply an expense. It's revenue protection. And sophisticated operators understand this. They don't wait until equipment fails. They schedule maintenance. They stock critical replacement parts. They monitor machinery. They train employees to identify problems early. Because downtime has an economic value. Now let's return to that $15. Suppose the customer buys your basic wash, but you offer a premium wash for $22. The difference might include wax, tire shine, extra cleaning stages, and better drying. From the customer's perspective, it's an upgrade. From the owner's perspective, it's something much more interesting. The incremental revenue can be substantial relative to the incremental cost. And this is where pricing architecture becomes important. You aren't really selling one product. You're selling a ladder. Basic, premium, unlimited, maybe an even higher package. The goal is to make the customer feel like they're choosing between levels of cleanliness, while you're actually optimizing average revenue per vehicle. Because 300 cars at $10 is very different from 300 cars at $18. Same traffic, same tunnel, same land, completely different economics. But the most powerful product on that ladder isn't the $22 Washington. It's the membership. Because a membership changes the relationship. Instead of waiting for a customer to decide whether their car is dirty enough to spend $15, you collect money before they even arrive. Let's say you charge $29.99 a month for unlimited washes. Now imagine 3,000 members. That's roughly $90,000 in monthly recurring membership revenue, before counting occasional customers, before premium upgrades, before other revenue streams. And suddenly the car wash begins to resemble a subscription business. But here's the strange part. The subscription only works because most members don't maximize what they bought. If every member washed their car every single day, the economics would look very different. The more often a customer thinks about washing their car, the more valuable that customer becomes. That's why location matters. That's why memberships matter. That's why branding matters. And that's why operators want to become part of the customer's routine. You don't want the customer thinking, my car is filthy. I need to find a car wash. You want, it's Thursday. Time to wash the car. That's a completely different customer relationship. And when thousands of people make that decision every month, the tunnel becomes something more than a machine. It becomes a recurring revenue engine. But there is still one problem. You can have the perfect tunnel, the perfect membership, the perfect pricing, and thousands of cars passing your property and still lose money. Because there's another machine underneath the car wash. And that machine doesn't wash cars. It washes debt. And next, we're going underneath the income statement to see where the money actually goes. The customer sees the tunnel. The owner sees the income statement. And those are two completely different things. Because once the car wash starts generating revenue, the money doesn't simply flow into the owner's bank account. It gets divided, first by operating expenses, then by maintenance, then by taxes, then by insurance. And if the property was financed, the bank takes its cut. Only after all of that does the owner get to ask the question, how much did I actually make? This is where the economics of car washes become less glamorous. Because the business has a strange cost structure. A large portion of its expenses are fixed. The land costs, the same whether 50 cars arrive or 500. The building costs the same. The equipment financing costs the same. Insurance doesn't disappear on rainy days. Property taxes don't care about traffic. And the debt payment certainly doesn't care. That creates enormous operating leverage. If volume rises, profit can rise much faster than revenue. But if volume falls, profit can collapse just as quickly. Imagine your car wash generates $1.5 million in annual revenue. Sounds impressive. Now imagine roughly $900,000 disappears into operating expenses, maintenance, labor, utilities, insurance, supplies, and other costs. You might have around $600,000 left before certain financing and ownership costs. That sounds excellent. Until you remember the building cost millions, and perhaps you borrowed heavily to buy it. Now the bank wants its payment every month. This is why cash flow is not the same thing as revenue. An accounting profit isn't always the same thing as cash available to the owner. The owner might have a profitable operation, but still have very little cash left after debt service. And this creates the first major financial trap. Leverage makes good car washes look incredible, but it can make mediocre car washes look disastrous. Suppose you buy a $4 million property. You put down $1 million. You borrow $3 million. Now you control a $4 million asset with $1 million of your own capital. If the property produces strong cash flow, your return on your actual invested equity can look fantastic. That's the attraction of real estate-backed businesses. But the reverse is also true. If revenue drops, if membership churn increases, if a competitor opens nearby, if interest rates rise, if equipment needs a major replacement, your debt doesn't shrink just because your revenue did. The bank still expects payment. That's the difference between owning a car wash with cash and owning one with leverage. And it gets even more interesting when you realize that many sophisticated operators aren't thinking only about the operating business. They're thinking about the real estate underneath it. Because the car wash may generate operating income while the land itself appreciates. And that creates two potential wealth engines. Cash flow today, asset appreciation tomorrow. But appreciation isn't guaranteed. And this is where people make another mistake. They assume that because a car wash property becomes more valuable, the business automatically becomes more profitable. It doesn't. A property can appreciate while the operating business deteriorates. And an excellent car wash can operate on land that barely appreciates. They're related, but they're not the same thing. The owner has to manage both, the business and the asset. Now consider the most important hidden cost of all, water. A car wash is one of those businesses where the resource customers barely think about is fundamental to the operation. You need water, lots of it. But modern operators don't simply pour fresh water down the drain after every vehicle. They use reclamation systems. They capture, filter, treat, reuse, and manage water consumption. Why? Because water isn't just an environmental issue. It's an economic variable. The more efficiently you can clean a vehicle while controlling water usage, the better your operating economics can become. Then there's electricity, the pumps, the motors, the dryers, the vacuums, the lighting, the control systems. A high-volume wash can consume substantial energy, and energy prices aren't fixed forever. So the owner is exposed to utility inflation. Then comes chemicals. And this is another area where scale matters. A large operator purchasing chemicals across dozens or hundreds of locations may have purchasing power a single location owner simply doesn't have. That means the industry has another hidden advantage: scale. If you own one car wash, you negotiate like one car wash. If you own 50, you negotiate like a company. That can affect chemical costs, equipment purchasing, marketing, technology, insurance, maintenance, and even financing, which creates a natural pressure toward consolidation. The bigger operators can spread overhead across more locations. A centralized management team can support multiple sites. Marketing can be shared. Membership programs can work across an entire network. And customers can recognize the same brand across multiple locations. That creates something even more valuable: a membership ecosystem. If I subscribe to a brand and I can wash my car at 5 locations instead of 1, the membership becomes more useful. The network becomes more valuable. And the operator gets something a single location owner doesn't have: geographic density. But now we reach another problem. Competition doesn't always mean another independent car wash. It can mean a giant chain. A well-capitalized operator can enter the market with a new tunnel, aggressive introductory pricing, cheap memberships, and a massive marketing budget. Suddenly, your $29.99 membership looks expensive, and the customer doesn't care about your mortgage. They care about price. This is where price wars begin. You lower your price, they lower theirs. You offer a discount, they offer an even bigger discount, and eventually, everyone is washing cars for less money. This is one of the most dangerous parts of the model, because the physical infrastructure is expensive, but the product itself is relatively easy to understand. There's no proprietary secret formula for washing a car. The competitive advantage comes from location, brand, speed, experience, membership base, scale, and operating efficiency. So if a competitor has a better location, or more capital, or a stronger membership network, you can lose market share surprisingly quickly. And then there's the weather, which might be the most ridiculous variable in the entire business. Rain, the natural enemy of the car wash. A customer sees rain falling from the sky and thinks, why would I pay to get my car wet? Of course, rain doesn't always destroy demand. Some weather can actually create demand later. But the timing matters. A rainy week can push customers away. A long dry spell can bring them back. Seasonality can change traffic. And regional climate can fundamentally change the economics of a location. That's why a car wash operator can't simply look at one month's revenue and assume they've found the truth. They need to understand the entire year, because a location generating $150,000 in one month might generate far less during another. And debt doesn't care about seasonality. The bank wants 12 payments, not 10 good months and 2 bad ones. This is why experienced operators build cash reserves. They don't distribute every dollar of apparent profit. They understand that eventually something expensive will break: a conveyor, a pump, a dryer, a water system, a control board, or something even worse, the entire tunnel. Because the most dangerous expense isn't always the one you can predict. It's the one that arrives suddenly. And this leads to the central contradiction of owning a car wash. The business looks automated from the outside, but the economics underneath are anything but automatic. Someone has to manage the equipment. Someone has to manage the employees. Someone has to manage the memberships. Someone has to manage the customers. Someone has to manage the water. Someone has to manage the debt. Someone has to manage the property. And someone has to make sure the tunnel keeps moving. Because the moment it stops, the entire economic machine stops with it. And that brings us to the real question. If this business is so dependent on volume, so dependent on location, so dependent on debt, and so vulnerable to competition, why are sophisticated investors still buying car washes? Because when the model works, the economics can become extremely powerful. And in the next part, the car wash business has a beautiful equation. More cars, more revenue. Fixed costs spread thinner. Higher margins. Simple, elegant, and dangerous. Because that equation only works if the cars keep coming. The moment volume falls, the entire machine starts moving backward. And this is where the difference between a great car wash and a bad one becomes brutally obvious. Imagine two locations. Both cost roughly $4 million. Both have similar equipment. Both charge around $15 per wash. Both have memberships. On paper, they look almost identical. But location A sits on a major commuter corridor. Thousands of cars pass every hour. Location B is 3 minutes away from the main road. Not far, just inconvenient. That tiny difference can destroy the economics. Because customers don't plan their entire day around washing a car. They choose the easiest option, the car wash they can see. The one they can enter without crossing traffic. The one they can reach without making a strange turn. The one that doesn't require waiting 20 minutes. And once a customer gets into a habit, they become difficult to steal. That's why the best locations are so valuable. They're not just generating today's revenue. They're protecting tomorrow's revenue. But location isn't the only thing that can break the model. Sometimes the owner simply pays too much. And this is one of the biggest mistakes in commercial real estate businesses. You can buy a good business at a bad price. Suppose a car wash produces $600,000 of annual operating cash flow. Sounds great. But if you pay $6 million for it, the economics are very different from paying $3 million. The business didn't change. The tunnel didn't change. The customers didn't change. Your purchase price changed. And that changes your return. This is why sophisticated buyers don't ask, "Is this car wash profitable?" They ask, "Is this car wash profitable at this valuation?" That's a completely different question. Because a 15% operating return on a cheap acquisition can be attractive. The same cash flow on an overpriced asset can be terrible. And the industry has another valuation problem. Car washes can look extremely attractive when interest rates are low. Cheap debt makes expensive assets easier to justify. If borrowing costs rise, the math changes. Suddenly, the same property needs to generate more cash just to support the financing. And this is where the car wash starts behaving less like a cleaning business and more like leveraged real estate. Which brings us to one of the most important lessons in the entire industry. Debt doesn't create profitability. It amplifies it. If the business is strong, leverage can make equity returns look incredible. If the business is weak, leverage can accelerate the collapse. And we have seen versions of this pattern across the broader car wash industry. One of the clearest examples is the rise and fall of Mr. Car Washes earlier. Growth story under aggressive expansion and changing market conditions, which demonstrates the tension between rapid unit growth, capital requirements, and store-level economics. But the more important lesson isn't whether one company succeeded or struggled. It's what the model teaches. Scale only works when individual locations work. If you multiply a good unit, you can create a powerful network. If you multiply a bad unit, you simply multiply the problem. And that's why sophisticated operators obsess over unit economics. Not just total company revenue, not just the number of locations, not just membership count. They want to know, how many cars does one location process? How much revenue does one location generate? What does labor cost? What does water cost? What does maintenance cost? How much cash flow remains? And how long does it take to recover the initial investment? Because if one location takes 10 years to pay back, opening 50 of them doesn't magically make the economics better. You now have 50 long payback periods. That's not scale. That's multiplied exposure. But when the unit economics are excellent, scale becomes incredibly powerful. Imagine a car wash generating strong cash flow from one location. Now duplicate it. then another, then another. Centralize management. Standardize operations. Share technology. Create one membership network. Negotiate supplies at scale. Now the economics begin changing. The corporate overhead doesn't necessarily increase at the same rate as revenue. That's operating leverage at the company level. And this is why consolidation has become such an important force in the car wash industry. The goal isn't simply to own more tunnels. It's to create a system where each additional tunnel becomes easier and cheaper to operate than the previous one. That is the difference between owning a car wash and building a car wash company. And one of the most powerful components of that system is the membership base. Let's say one location has 5,000 members. That's valuable. But imagine an operator with 100 locations and millions of membership. Relationships spread across the network. Now the customer isn't tied to one physical site. They're tied to the brand. That creates switching costs, convenience, frequency, and recurring revenue. But memberships can also hide problems. A company can report rapidly growing membership while heavily discounting those memberships. The headline number looks fantastic. 99-cent promotion. The economics underneath membership is not equivalent to a $29.99 full-price membership. And a member who cancels after 3 months isn't worth the same as one who stays for 3 years. So the real metric isn't simply, how many members do you have? It's, how much lifetime value does each member produce? That's where the business becomes much more sophisticated. Customer acquisition cost, monthly churn, average revenue per member, visit frequency, lifetime value. These numbers determine whether the subscription engine is actually healthy. And here's the strange part. A customer can be more valuable than the wash itself. If someone stays subscribed for 3 years, they might generate more than $1,000 in cumulative revenue. You didn't sell them one wash. You acquired a recurring customer relationship. And that relationship can be worth more than the equipment they drive through. But there is still one major threat. The customer can leave. Maybe they move. Maybe they stop caring. Maybe they find a cheaper competitor. Maybe they realize they don't use the membership enough. Maybe another chain opens across the street. So churn becomes the silent enemy. And churn doesn't arrive with a broken pump. It arrives quietly, one cancellation at a time, a few hundred cancellations a month, and suddenly your growth story disappears. This is why the best operators don't simply chase new customers. They protect existing ones. Cleaner facilities, faster tunnels, better customer service, more convenient locations, better mobile apps, more membership flexibility. Because retaining a customer is often cheaper than replacing one. And this creates a fascinating economic loop. Better experience creates retention. Retention creates predictable revenue. Predictable revenue supports better financing. Better financing supports more locations. More locations create stronger membership value. And stronger membership value creates even more retention. That's the flywheel. But flywheels can also reverse. Bad service creates cancellations. Cancellations reduce revenue. Lower revenue creates cost pressure. Cost pressure creates maintenance cuts. Maintenance cuts create equipment failures. Equipment failures create worse customer experience. And worse customer experience creates more cancellations. Same machine, opposite direction. That's why car washes can look incredibly stable right before the economics start deteriorating. And then there's another threat owners don't control, the economy. When people feel wealthier, they spend more freely. When household budgets tighten, small discretionary expenses become easier to cut. A $20 car wash isn't rent. It isn't groceries. It isn't electricity. It's optional. And optional spending is vulnerable. But there's an interesting counterargument. Even during difficult economic periods, people still need transportation. They still commute. They still own cars. And eventually, they still want those cars clean. That's why the industry can be more resilient than some other discretionary businesses. But resilient doesn't mean immune. The real protection comes from the cost structure. If an operator can keep labor low, maintain equipment efficiently, control water and chemical consumption, and keep membership revenue stable, the business can survive surprisingly difficult conditions. If the operator has massive debt, high rent, weak traffic, and expensive maintenance, the same recession can become fatal. And that's the ultimate lesson. There is no single car wash business model. There are good locations, bad locations, cheap acquisitions, overpriced acquisitions, efficient operators, wasteful operators. strong membership bases, weak membership bases, low debt, and dangerous debt. The tunnel is only the visible part. The real business is the economic system surrounding it. And when that system is designed correctly, the car wash can become something much more powerful than a place where people clean their cars. It becomes a machine that converts traffic into recurring revenue into cash flow, and cash flow into an appreciating asset. But now we have to answer the final question. After the land, the tunnel, the memberships, the debt, the maintenance, the employees, the water, the chemicals, and all the hidden costs, how much money does the owner actually get to keep? Because that's where the fantasy finally meets the balance sheet. So, after everything, the land, the building, the tunnel, the water, the chemicals, the employees, the maintenance, the insurance, the debt, the memberships, the cancellations, the competitors, the weather, what does the owner actually have? Because that's the only number that matters. Not how many cars you wash, not how many members you have, not how impressive the building looks from the road. What survives after everyone else gets paid? Let's go back to our hypothetical car wash. Suppose the operation generates around $1.6 million in annual revenue. That sounds enormous for one location. But now strip it down. Labor takes a portion. Utilities take a portion. Water and chemicals take a portion. Maintenance takes a portion. Insurance takes a portion. Credit card fees take a portion. Property expenses take a portion. Marketing and software take a portion. And eventually, the equipment needs to be repaired or replaced. After operating expenses, perhaps the location produces something like $500,000 to $650. 000 in property level. Operating cash flow, depending heavily on traffic, pricing, membership mix, local costs, and operational efficiency. That's the number that starts getting interesting. Because now you have an asset producing hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. But remember what you had to buy to create it. Millions of dollars of land and infrastructure. And if you borrowed to acquire it, the owner doesn't get that $500,000. Not yet. The bank gets paid first. Suppose the property carries several million dollars of debt. Your annual debt service could consume a very significant portion of that cash flow. Now the owner might be left with something closer to a few $100,000 of annual cash flow before taxes and other owner-level considerations. And suddenly the economics look very different from the $1.6 million headline revenue. This is why sophisticated investors don't obsess over revenue. They obsess over cash-on-cash return. How much cash did I actually invest? And how much cash does that investment produce? If you put $1 million into a car wash and it eventually produces $150,000 of annual cash flow to equity, that's a 15% cash-on-cash return. That's a completely different way of looking at the business. You're no longer asking, how much does the car wash make? You're asking, how hard is my money working? And this is where leverage can become extremely powerful. Because suppose you control a $4 million asset, but only invested $1 million of your own capital. If the property performs well, your equity can grow much faster than the underlying business alone would suggest. The loan is being paid down. The property may appreciate. The business generates cash, and the owner builds equity. 3 engines: cash flow, debt paydown, appreciation. That's the real reason sophisticated investors, like asset-backed businesses, the owner isn't only collecting today's cash. They're potentially building tomorrow's balance sheet. But again, the same mechanism works in reverse. If the property value falls, equity can disappear. If revenue falls, debt coverage weakens. If interest rates rise, financing becomes more expensive. If a major equipment failure occurs, cash flow gets hit. Leverage doesn't care which direction the business is moving. It simply magnifies the result. And this is why the smartest car wash owners think less like car washers and more like capital allocators. They're asking, where should I buy? How much should I pay? How much debt should I use? How much cash should I keep? What return do I need? How much volume can the site realistically support? How many memberships can I build? And most importantly, what happens if I'm wrong? Because the best business plan isn't the one that looks incredible in the perfect scenario. It's the one that survives an ugly scenario. Imagine your expected traffic is 400 cars a day, but you only get 300. Can the business still pay its debt? Can it still maintain the tunnel? Can you survive a major equipment failure? Can you survive a competitor opening nearby? Can you survive 6 weeks of weak weather? If the answer is no, then you didn't buy a business. You bought a bet. And that's the difference between sophisticated ownership and entrepreneurial gambling. Now there's another layer: exit value. Eventually, you may want to sell. And the buyer isn't going to care how much you personally love the car wash. They'll look at its economics, revenue, cash flow, memberships, location, competition, real estate, growth potential, equipment condition, debt, and the expected future earnings. If you built a strong operation, the buyer may pay a premium because they're not just buying today's cash flow. They're buying the future cash flow. And this is where the entire economic machine comes full circle. You buy the property. You improve the operation. You grow membership. You increase traffic. You improve margins. You pay down debt. The property appreciates. Then eventually, you sell. And the next owner takes over the machine. That's how a car wash can turn into a wealth-building asset. But there's an uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. The car wash isn't necessarily the thing making you wealthy. The combination of real estate plus recurring revenue plus operating leverage plus leverage from debt is. The tunnel is simply the mechanism that ties those things together. And this explains why some car wash owners build enormous businesses, while others struggle with a single location. The difference isn't necessarily who washes more cars. It's who understands the economic system. Because if you only understand washing cars, you're an operator. If you understand traffic, you're a location strategist. If you understand memberships, you're building recurring revenue. If you understand debt, you're managing capital. If you understand real estate, you're building equity. And if you understand all of them together, you're no longer really running a car wash. You're running a capital-intensive recurring revenue real estate business. And that's the real economics. A customer might think they're paying you $30 to wash their car. But underneath that transaction, you're using their payment to support a much larger machine. Their subscription helps stabilize revenue. Revenue supports cash flow. Cash flow supports debt service. Debt paydown builds equity. The property can appreciate. And eventually, that equity can be refinanced or sold. So the $30 wash isn't the wealth. The system around the $30 wash is. And now we can reduce the entire business to one equation: traffic times conversion times average. Revenue per customer times retention minus labor plus utilities plus chemicals plus maintenance plus occupancy costs plus overhead plus debt equals owner economics. That's it. Everything else is decoration: the giant sign, the foam, the spinning brushes, the vacuum stations, the shiny building, the membership app. They are all components of the same machine. And the machine only works when enough customers move through it at a high enough price, often enough, while costs remain controlled. That is why the best car washes aren't necessarily the biggest. They're the ones with the best unit economics: a great location, high throughput, strong membership penetration, controlled operating costs, reliable equipment, disciplined debt, and enough cash reserves to survive the inevitable problems. Put those together, and you can create an extremely attractive business. But get even one major variable wrong, and the economics can turn quickly. Pay too much for the land. Overbuild the tunnel. Take on too much debt. Underestimate maintenance. Choose a weak location. Ignore churn. Start a price war. And suddenly the same machine that looked like a money printer becomes a very expensive monthly obligation. That's the brutal truth. Owning a car wash is not about washing cars. It's about controlling a location, building a high-throughput operation, creating recurring customers, and making sure the cash generated by those customers exceeds the cost of owning the entire machine. The people who understand that can build serious wealth. The people who don't can spend millions, building a beautiful place for other people to wash their cars. And maybe that's the final lesson. The customer sees a clean windshield. The employee sees a conveyor. The bank sees a loan. The investor sees an asset. But the owner, if they're good, sees something completely different. A machine that converts traffic into cash flow into equity, and equity into wealth. So you want to own a car wash? Then don't start by asking which tunnel to buy. Ask where the cars are. Ask how many will actually stop. Ask what they'll pay. Ask how often they'll return. Ask what it costs to keep the machine running. Ask how much debt the cash flow can safely support. And finally, ask the question that separates a business from a fantasy. What happens when the cars stop coming? because that's when you find out whether you actually bought a car wash or just bought yourself a very expensive tunnel. If this video changed the way you think about car washes, comment below with one business you want me to break down next by saying, so you want to own a underscore 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 underscore. And if you enjoy deep financial documentaries that reveal how businesses really make money, subscribe, because the next industry might look ordinary from the outside, but its economics are anything but.